I am Caleb.
Caleb Ward.
I want you to walk out of this town with me, and I promise to her a hardship.
Please marry me. The silent deserter vows to save Apache woman caged by the town, and this happened. Apache Springs, New Mexico Territory, June 1878. The afternoon sun hung like a white-hot coin over Apache Springs, hammering the false front buildings and bleaching the prayer flags of dust that lifted off the hardpan street. By 3 o'clock, the heat had a taste alkali, old iron, and that sour whisper of gun oil that never left a town where law traveled on horseback. Caleb Ward stood on the boardwalk outside the assay office with the stiff weariness of a man who hadn't slept in 36 hours and had nothing left to sell but the scar under his collar and a name he wasn't sure he deserved. He counted 12 steps to the corner, 2 hitching posts, 1 broken water barrel, and like a thunderhead in the middle of the square, an iron cage 8 feet tall and 6 wide, sun-baked and cruel, in the way only human things could be. If you're into Wild West love stories or the rough-heart Wild West stories we spin on Wild West Love, drop a flood of 1 second and your place in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from, partner, and ride along. The cage didn't belong to the town. It belonged to fear. Caleb saw it in the way folks hovered, men with whiskers like wire brushes, women with sunburnt cheeks and shawls tight over bones, as if the cage were a bad-tempered bull. Inside sat a woman with her knees drawn up, wrists cuffed and linked to a floor ring, hair black as crow-wing and matted with the red grit of the basin. She wasn't looking at them. She was looking through them, beyond buildings, beyond this square, beyond the words flung at her like stones. Ahioka. Someone whispered near Caleb, a woman's voice cautious as a match in wind. Mescalero Apache. Another voice, a man with tobacco on his breath. They found her near Dead Man Arroyo, tracks to a busted wagon. Garrett boys shot, bones at a camp. Circle judge'll be through in a week. Caleb's throat tightened. He knew what men could turn into when fear boiled, and the judge was still a horizon away. He'd once worn blue, ridden in neat lines, believed orders carried a kind of holiness. Then a general told him to ride on a Chiricahua camp, women, children, and holiness shattered like glass on rock. He'd stepped out of that line, put down his carbine, and watched the world cross its arms against him. That was 2 winters ago. Since then, he'd measured towns in cups of coffee gone cold, and the number of times he said, "just passing through," and meant it. Sheriff Doyle Bradley stood near the cage with his thumbs hooked in his belt and the pink rims of a sunburn climbing out from his collar. "Move along," he called, wide voice for a wide street. "Ain't nothing to see but what's already been seen." Caleb studied the woman. Not a flinch, not a plea. Her stillness wasn't animal. It was deliberate, like a prayer, like the way a wounded man holds himself when he knows his blood is running out and won't give the watchers the satisfaction of a moan. She had the fine-boned face of desert people and a ribbon of dried blood at her temple that the women on the boardwalk pretended not to see. The town wanted a monster. All he saw was a person burning down to ember. He stepped off the boardwalk. "Friend," Bradley said, lazy but ready, "you deaf to English or just courting trouble in Spanish? What's her charge?" Caleb's voice came out hoarse, sifted through 100 miles of dust. "Suspicion of murder." Bradley's jaw was square as a fence post. "Tom Garrett, respected boy, found dead in the hills. She was near. That's enough for me." "Enough for a cage," Caleb said. "Enough for baking a person alive. Is it enough for the rope?" A murmur ran through the crowd, men pleased by the word rope, the way roosters are pleased by dawn. The sheriff's mouth flattened. "Judge'll decide. We don't hang without paper." Caleb walked closer to the bars. He crouched, slow so as not to spook the fear that always twitched in a circle like this. The woman's eyes lifted, and he felt a physical jolt, like he'd stepped from shade into noon irises, dark, pupils glinting, a storm held behind a dam someone else built. She was younger than he'd thought. 20? 22? The cuffs were too small, bitten deep into bone. He scraped for something soft to put between them and her skin, and came up with nothing but his own hand. "What's your name?" He spoke like a man at a cliff edge, calm because the rocks listen. "I'm Caleb Ward." When she answered, it was not with words. Her mouth worked once, twice, then tightened but with the smallest tilt of her chin, neither yes nor no, merely I hear you. Then she looked past him to the mountain line, as if she could see every wash and pinyon stand between here and whatever she'd lost. Careful, a woman hissed. Last man got too near, nearly lost a finger. Caleb nodded to the sheriff. She got water? Twice a day. Now, Caleb said, it's 3 o'clock and she's cooking. Bradley stared, measuring the crowd. Mercy can turn an audience mean. He jerked his chin at a deputy, who fetched a bucket and a dipper. When the deputy shoved the dipper through the bars like you'd feed a dog, Caleb took it from him, slow and plain, and crouched again. He set the dipper near her bound hands. The chain's bite was wrong for drinking. She angled and sipped, careful, a body trained to make do. Some of the water spilled along her throat, carrying a line of red dust down into the collar of her torn calico. "What are you doing, mister?" The question came like a knife flicked from somewhere in the crowd. "Noticing," he said. "What's that buy you?" "Maybe what it buys her," he answered. "An inch. A man should leave such a square. He should step back into his own life and let the world grind. But sometimes you stand where your past plants you." Caleb stood. He counted the iron bars, counted the number of faces eager to be cruel, counted the coins in his pocket, 6 silver pieces, 1 dull copper, and knew math alone wouldn't change the ending waiting here. "Sheriff," he said, still crouched, speaking up and across. "If a citizen takes legal responsibility, you can release a prisoner into custody pending judge." "You volunteering to be the fool?" Bradley barked a laugh. "She's Apache, and you look light in the pockets." "My pockets get heavier if I sell my rifle," Caleb said. He did not look away from the woman. "And my name's not nothing." "Ward?" The sheriff spat. "Plenty of wards in the army rolls." "Plenty left those rolls," Caleb said. A ripple went through the crowd at the word left. He felt it hit his spine. Men who left lines were either cowards or stubborn saints, and both made people itch. He swallowed, and did the strange, reckless thing his bones had been leaning toward since he stepped off the boards. "I'll marry her," he said into the heat. The square froze. Someone laughed a short, nervous bark. A boy swore softly. A woman said, "Lord have mercy," and didn't sound like she wanted him to. Bradley stared as if Caleb had offered to lasso the sun. "You drunk, Ward?" "Wouldn't waste good whiskey in this heat," Caleb said. He stood up so the words would carry. "Sheriff, you know as well as I do that a man's wife is his lawful charge. You let men take wives out of jail for debt every spring when the cattle money's thin. I'll sign whatever you shove under me. I'll get her out of your town, and you can show the judge neat bookkeeping instead of a sun-sick body." That. A figure detached from the shade of the mercantile. Old man, cane carved with a vine twist, eyes bright and mean with intelligence. Judge Patrick O'Brien. If memory served, Caleb had seen him once before in Las Cruces, lecturing a deputy about writs. The old man limped forward and looked from Caleb to the cage, then to Bradley. "He's right," O'Brien said, voice like a saw going true. "Territorial code allows conditional release to spouse or surety with sworn responsibility when circuit court is delayed. It's 97 miles to Santa Fe, and I got bunions. The court is delayed." "Judge," Bradley began, "this ain't a debt case. We got a dead Garrett, 3 children without a father." O'Brien's knuckles whitened on the cane. "And therefore we will have law, not a spectacle. The last time I saw an iron cage in a square, it weren't the guilty inside it." "Oh well?" The crowd stirred ugly. Marcus Garrett shouldered through, tall, clean-frocked, the churned rage of a man grieving and loving the taste of it. "That devil killed my brother," he said, voice carrying. "You'd marry her to a stranger and call that justice?" Caleb turned, careful. "I'd call it time. Time to learn what happened without choking on the smell of hot iron." Garrett's gaze landed on him, flicked to the woman, back to him. "Say her name then," he snapped. "If you're so pure, say the name of who you'd bed." Caleb looked at her again. He let the quiet between them be real. "If she tells me, I'll say it," he said. "Till then, I'll say the name my people would call her. Sister, neighbor, human." It was a foolish line and a true one. Sometimes they're the same thing. O'Brien lifted his cane. "Sheriff Bradley, Open that door. Keys on a ring. The scrape of metal. The smell of heat coming off iron like an exhale from hell's own horse. Caleb felt the world narrow to hinges and dust. The door swung, and the sheriff's Colt moved half an inch in his holster, a snake twitch. "Slow," Bradley said. "Any trouble, and I shoot through both of you to save paper." The woman uncoiled slow, like a cat stretching that's forgotten being watched, stood, and stepped forward until she filled the threshold with bone and shadow. Up close she was taller than he'd thought, strong through shoulders and hips from a life of carrying what the land demanded. There was a thin rope scar at the base of her throat and another across her left forearm that had healed jagged knife or claw. He couldn't tell. Caleb lifted his hands, palms out, like a man approaching a skittish stallion. "I'm Caleb," he said. "Caleb Ward. I'm asking you to walk out of this town with me, and I'm promising to hold the trouble while you breathe. If you want that," he swallowed. "If you do, I'll stand here in front of God and a judge and say I'm your husband." A long beat, in which the square breathed like a single body drawn, held, hurting. The woman looked past him to the mountains again, then back to his hands, to his face, and something fragile shifted, the way wind shifts when a storm line finally breaks. She lifted her chin and gave the smallest nod. The judge nodded back, formal as a church bell. "Do you, Caleb Ward, take this woman?" Caleb raised a hand, sudden. "Judge, she deserves her name." The woman's mouth moved. The first breath came rough, the second stronger. "Ayoka," she said, voice low and beautiful as creek water under cottonwoods. She touched her chest. "Ayoka." Caleb closed his eyes a second, the name like a swallow of clear water. "Ayoka," he repeated, careful with it. When he opened his eyes, he saw a shine in hers that wasn't heat. O'Brien's voice shentled. "Do you, Caleb Ward, take Ayoka with all dangers and duties the territory's dust can pile on a soul?" "I do." "And you, Ayoka, take this man knowing the same?" Her mouth trembled once grief, passing like a shadow of a hawk, and then settled. "I do. By law, and whatever heaven still cares to eavesdrop on this county," O'Brien said, cane thumping. "Your husband and wife. Sheriff, unfasten those cuffs." Bradley swore, but he unlocked the irons. The steel fell away with a small, indecent sound. Ayoka rubbed her wrists, and when she lifted her head, the square seemed to tilt. It is a terrible thing to watch a person step across a line from thing to someone again. Caleb shrugged off his neckerchief, folded it twice, and bound the angry skin of her wrists, his fingers careful, his heart miscounting beats. Marcus Garrett's voice cut through the spell. "You walk out of this town, Ward, and you carry my brother's blood into those hills. They'll be settling." Caleb met his eyes. "Then come to me straight, not to cages and whispers. I'll look you in the face and answer." They left under a sky turning copper at the edges. The desert's evening wind carried creosote and the faint, sweet breath of a juniper spring. Ayoka walked a little ahead, as if her body remembered leading. Caleb matched her pace. At the edge of town, the road fell away into darkening country, the mesas stacked like collapsed churches. He glanced back once. O'Brien stood under the hotel awning, hat in hand. Bradley had retreated to the jailhouse, a shout already starting somewhere down the street that would turn into a story by midnight and a legend by winter. "You got anywhere you'd rather go?" Caleb asked, voice low for her, not for the town. Ayoka tipped her face to the wind, eyes half closed, reading it the way ranchers read ledger lines. "North," she said, "where the cottonwoods keep the water when July forgets mercy." "But I can do north," he said. "Got 2 hands and a decent sense of when a man ought to keep his mouth shut." That won something like a smile, small, vivid, there and gone. They walked. The sun slid. At 5 miles the road gave up pretending to be civil and turned to 2 ruts and a prayer. When the stars came, more of them than anyone from Ohio or Boston could count, he built a fire from pinyon and the brittle bones of a dead cholla, and she showed him where to tuck the coals so wind wouldn't bully them. He set a tin of water to warm, tore a strip from his shirt for a better bandage, and she watched his hands with a frankness that made him feel both seen and weighed. "You been hungry long?" he asked. 3 days, she said. Before that, she lifted one shoulder, a practical history. Before that, Cage. He passed her jerky and half a biscuit he'd shoved in his coat that morning. She ate like a person who knew each bite's arithmetic. Chew, swallow, live. When she finished, she reached into the pocket of her torn skirt and drew out a tiny thing wrapped in buckskin, a beadwork square no bigger than a postage stamp. Blood, brown and sky blue, edges singed. She held it like a coin at a church plate, then tucked it back. "What is it?" he asked, soft. "Home," she said, and the word broke a little, then survived, sturdy as a fence post in wind. They talked in fits, like two people learning to breathe in the same room. She told him there were 3 men at the arroyo, not one. That Tom Garrett had been drunk and careless as a man who thinks the world owes him. That bones in that camp were old as dry riverbeds, the kind you find when bandits pillage and coyotes complete the work. She told him other things without words, the way her shoulders tightened at a wolf howl, the way her eyes gentled at a nightjar's 2-note call, the way she thanked him for heat by sitting just close enough to share it. At midnight, wind cooled to something kind. He laid his coat half over her and half over himself, a ragged treaty. "Tomorrow," he said into the darkness, "because tomorrow is sometimes a spell. We'll find water, then cottonwood, then a place to lay 2 blankets and call it not Cage." "Tomorrow," she said, and the way she said it turned the ordinary into a vow. When he slept, he dreamed of iron bending, not under hammers but under hands, until it softened into something a person could live inside. When he woke, she was already up, barefoot and silent, the dawn rhyming her hair with silver. She looked back at him with eyes that had measured a different set of distances than his, and nodded once as if to say, "We did not die today. Let's spend that like smart people." Caleb stood, stretched the road out of his spine, and checked the sky. No clouds, no mercy. But north was north, and the cottonwoods were a kind of promise. He shouldered the small life he owned, and together they stepped into the morning, 2 figures small as ants under a cathedral of blue, headed toward water, and whatever might lay beyond it, justice if the world had any left, forgiveness if either of them could afford it, and a kind of love that starts as survival and grows stubborn, green, inevitable out of ground, that remembers blood and chooses blossom anyway. By first light, the desert had the color of a burned hymn, all ash-blue mesas and coyote tracks stitched across the hardpan like a thread the night forgot to tuck away. Caleb counted the small mercies. 1 canteen half full, 2 biscuits wrapped in old newsprint, a pocket full of jerky, and the way the dawn wind slid cool along his shirt before the sun woke mean. Ahioka moved ahead of him by 3 strides, reading the land the way a blacksmith reads heat by feel, by breath, by the small changes you only notice after years of standing close to fire. They followed the shadowed lip of an arroyo that had cut the world open and laid it down in layers, rust, ochre, the pale chalk of old bones. 30 minutes in, she lifted her hand. He stopped. A pair of ravens flared up from a mesquite snag, scolding as if they owned the sky. "Water," she said, nodding toward the bend where cottonwoods wrote their tall green letters against the warmth. "If we get there before the sun climbs a hand." "How many hands is trouble?" Caleb asked. She glanced at the sky, measured with her palm. 2. He didn't argue. The territory spoke in arithmetic. How many miles to the next shade? How many bullets? How many heartbeats? Until a man decided you were worth the rope. He kept pace, listening to the chain tinkle that had haunted him since yesterday. The sound wasn't there anymore. His mind supplied it anyway, until the breeze threaded the cottonwoods, and he heard a real music, the soft talk of hidden water. The spring lay in a pocket of rock, cold as a promise no one believes until it's drunk. They knelt, one at each side, and filled the canteen. When she cupped her hands and drank, he saw the raw bands where iron had chewed her wrists. He dampened his neckerchief, folded it twice, and tied a new, cleaner wrapping. "Too tight?" he asked. A shake of the head. "Good." She touched the cloth once, not quite a thanks, more a recognition. "This thing exists because you chose it." They ate in the narrow shade cast by a boulder the size of a freight stove. At 9 o'clock he checked by the slant of light. They started again. The country opened into a basin of rabbit brush and scattered pinyon. Far to the west, thunderheads stacked like silver anvils over the Mogollon. The monsoons were coming. Out here, rain was a gambler with a crooked smile. It could break your drought or break your neck. "Why north?" Caleb asked, when the silence between them felt heavy with unasked questions. "You said cottonwood keeps water. There other reason?" Ahyoka's eyes tracked a hawk spiraling so high it looked like somebody's thrown coin. "Memories blow south," she said. "North is where wind forgets." "Vend." He nodded. "All right. North at Island." She walked with a careful economy, no wasted steps, no bravado like a person who had learned early that pride is expensive and the land keeps receipts. When they crossed a patch of black rock scattered with tubes of old lava, she stopped suddenly and pointed with 2 fingers. "Mojave Green," she whispered. The rattler lay in a coil of living jade up against a sun-warmed stone, head up, tongue testing the world. Caleb's breath lodged halfway. He had seen men shot and get back up. He had seen one man take a bite from a green rattler and sit very still while the world unstitched itself around him. Ahyoka took a long step back, then another, and eased him behind her without touching. The snake hummed a warning the way a kettle hums before boiling. "Give him road," she said. They did, arcing a wide half-circle 15 paces, 20 until the rattle quieted and the snake slid like spilled rope into shadow. "Seems like everything out here announces itself," Caleb said when his lungs remembered how. "Except men," she said. And there was no heat in it, just the flat truth of a ledger. They rested at noon in a shallow wash where saltbush shrugged up from the sand. He took out a whetstone and went to work on his knife, not for need so much as to give his hands purpose. She watched the slow, steady scrape, then drew a bundle from her skirt, a beaded strip, smoke singed at one corner. This time she let him see it. Ziu, she touched the blue triangle's mountain. Water, she tapped the white. And this, she traced the brown line that meandered through the pattern. Road that goes both ways. "It's fine work," he said. "Who made it?" "Shima," she said after a breath. "My mother." She looked toward the mountain rim. "She said a good path is made of 2 roads, not 1. He rolled that in his mouth. "I ain't good at the second road," he admitted. "Spent a lot of years walking in one direction, and then I stepped off. Folks don't forgive the footprint." She angled him a look that was almost amused. "Second roads are for the living." The afternoon burned. Heat came off the ground in visible veils, and distance lied for a hobby. They topped a rise and found the next miles braided with dry gullies, blue grama shimmering in ripples, as if the earth remembered being an ocean. She began to teach him names because names make a place less sharp. "Yucca," she said, palming the high stalk, where seed pods clapped like little brown hands in the wind. "Soap plant," and mesquite. She touched the thorn with a fingertip. "Fire that waits." He pointed to a line of low, silvery shrubs. "And that?" "Sage. Good to sing over." "Sing over?" "For courage." A half smile. "You sing?" "Badly," he said. "Good." She nodded. "The spirits laugh when men sing bad. They listen closer." Lao. By 3 o'clock, the first anvil cloud threw a wide shadow across the basin. A gust hit not cold, just full of the smell of rain a county away, followed by the dry whisper that means a storm might stand on your doorstep and never not. Ahyoka halted again and faced the wind with her eyes closed, as if reading a letter written on the air. "Come," she said. "Haboob." Great." Caleb didn't ask. He saw it then what he would have thought was a low wall of far mesa, until it moved with terrible speed, a brown front rolling and rising, the desert lifting itself into the sky. They ran for the nearest cover, a fold in the land where a ledge of sandstone overhung a pocket big enough for 2 if they weren't particular. Ahyoka slid in first and tugged him after. The wind hit the ledge with the sound of 1,000 hands slapping water. Sand wormed into every seam, hissed across teeth, scoured knuckles raw. He tried to shield her with his body. She tried to shield him with hers. In the end, they crouched chest to back, her braid whipping his cheek, his coat thrown like a roof over both their heads, the storm's breath rattling it like an animal trying to get in. "How long?" he shouted against the roar. "Count to 200, she shouted back. He did. Twice. On the 300 the wind began to tire, and the light changed the angry yellow cooling to a darker, calmer tone. The dust settled like a bargain no one was happy with. They coughed a while in the sudden quiet. When he lifted the coat, it avalanched fine grit into both their laps, and she laughed, a brief, clear sound that made something in his chest loosen. "Next time," she said, wiping sand from her mouth with the heel of her hand, "we find cave before sky gets tired of being sky." That. He stared at her, then found himself laughing too, a rusty sound that felt like he was borrowing someone else's voice. Deal. They waited until their breathing forgot the storm. Then Ahyoka crawled out and stood, shaking dust from her hair. The world looked remade, every surface softened, every outline blurred, the sky a clean-washed blue, as if nothing violent ever happened here. That was how the territory lied. It smiled with its whole mouth and waited for you to forget the tooth it kept behind its back. Toward evening they found what water had carved over years but only gives in seasons, a pool tucked into a bend of dark rock where maidenhair ferns clung like secrets. They washed the dust off their faces, off the places where skin bends and complains, and he cleaned her wristbands again, smoothing salve made of bear fat and turpentine into the angry grooves. She watched his hands work with a guarded softness. "You know medicine?" she asked. "Forge medicine," he said. "Burns, cuts, the stupid way men hold a hot shoe, even after you say it's hot. And your medicine?" She tapped lightly above his heart, not touching, just pointing at the place where a man keeps things he can't carry anywhere else. He looked at the pool until his face stopped being the face of a stranger. "I had a wife," he said. "I had a notion she deserved a man who knew the difference between orders and right. I left the first. I don't know if I ever found the second. She left before the war did, south to her people in Texas. Haven't seen her in 2 years. Ahyoka nodded as if counting aloud the spaces in his words. "Sometimes leaving is a door, sometimes it is a hole. And this?" He gestured north. "Which one is it for you?" She looked past him into the trees the spring kept alive, as if the leaves could answer. "Both," she said, and he heard no drama in it, only the accuracy of a smith's file against metal. "I leave a place where people watch a woman die slow in a cage. I go to a place where trees remember water. The hole will follow. The door will too." Night built itself with the method of a careful craftsman. 1 star, then 3, then more than any person had time to name. They ate in a hush that felt more companionable than any talking he remembered, jerky, chewed to tenderness, a handful of parched corn she had wrapped in muslin and stashed where the iron hadn't bit. He built a small fire, no bigger than a hat, and ringed it with stones so the wind couldn't boss it. She fed its edges with slivers of pinyon, as if she knew the fire's manners and meant to honor them. After a time, Ahyoka took a breath and sang. The melody was low and slow, the kind of song you could carry for 7 miles without feeling it pull. He didn't understand the words, but he recognized what they were built of, loss braided into endurance, the way a far rider braids horsehair into rope to keep his hands busy while his heart waits. When she finished, he didn't clap. He said the only thing that fit. "Thank you. Your turn," she said. He shook his head. "Told you. Bad. Spirits laugh," she reminded, small smile. "They listen." He tried. A camp song from Missouri boys he'd bunked with, sung too low and flat, the notes going wrong like a nail driven at an angle. She did laugh soft, delighted, and he found he didn't mind being the kind of joke that healed instead of cut. Later, when the fire was the size of a newborn's palm, he unrolled his bedroll thin, as a story on the side of the coals the wind wouldn't steal. She settled the other side, 3 feet between them that felt like an ocean and a promise both. He stared up at the black-bellied sky and listened to the small sounds, the tick of cooling stones, a nightjar's 2-syllable prayer, the slow cadence of her breath. Somewhere into that counting, he slept. They walked again at dawn, feet harmlessly noisy on the crusted surface where the dust had set like just-baked bread. By the 4th mile, a new shape appeared on the horizon, a paler green than cottonwood, broader leaves that flashed silver when the wind pawed them. Below, tucked into a fold of earth, lay a strip of grass with a curve of water so clear the stones at the bottom looked like coins waiting for a wish. Ahyoka halted at the lip of the basin, Her eyes moved over it, not hungry, not afraid, just careful, like a person reading the face of someone they might love if it didn't kill them first. "This good," she said at last. "Creek will not die in August. Cottonwoods there. She pointed. "Juniper for smoke, that doesn't talk. Rock enough for stove, see?" She traced a rectangle in the air. "We can sleep out of wind." The word we hung in the morning like a bell no church had claimed. Caleb squatted and picked up a flat stone. He scraped its face across a patch of ground until he'd cleared a square foot of dust, then drew lines with the tip of his knife. 4 sides, a door on the south to catch winter sun, a hearth on the east where morning would sit with its back to them. As he drew, she crouched beside him and added with a stick, a shelf here, notched posts there, a trench along the uphill side so flash floods had the decency to knock before entering. He looked up, caught her studying him with a gravity that felt like trust trying on its boots. "I don't know your words for home," he said, "but I can make a roof that doesn't leak and a hinge that won't squeal loud enough to wake coyotes." She brushed the drawing of the door with her fingertip. "Kea," she said. "Land, place. Home is when your breath knows the smell of morning before you open your eyes." He nodded. "Then let's give our breath something to learn." They built small the first day. A lean, to ribbed with willow cut from the creek, skinned with brush, weighted with a lattice of deadfall. He worked with a quiet intensity. She worked like weather constant, practical, knowing where to put force and where to let the world hold itself. Midday, they broke for a handful of prickly pear fruit she harvested with a forked stick and skinned with that neat, exacting patience desert people have for small pains that avoid big ones. He showed her how to lash a makeshift rake out of green saplings and bark cordage for dragging brush. She showed him how to read the ant trails to find where ground lay higher and stayed dry in a sudden storm. By sunset, they had a shelter a child wouldn't brag about and 2 grown people could be grateful for. He lit the first cooking fire in a ring of stones and laid the iron skillet he'd hauled across 5 counties on it like it was a small altar. She laughed at the way his face softened at the smell of hot metal and flour, and he laughed at himself for being the kind of man who falls silent in front of a biscuit that rises right. They ate in the hush that settles when work has trued 2 strangers into partners, at least for a day. When the last light gathered itself and walked off toward the west, he turned and saw her not as a figure to guard or a story to correct, but as a person sitting in the doorway of something they were making with their hands because life had taken other doors away. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll start a chimney. We'll need it before August forgets its temper and throws rain sideways." "Tomorrow," she agreed. Then she looked at him with that same measuring gravity and added, almost shy, "Caleb Ward, you did not have to step from the boardwalk yesterday." "No," he said, feeling the truth of it like weight and like wings. "But I had to step from somewhere." She considered that, then leaned back on her hands and looked up at the sky where the Milky Way had poured itself like spilled salt. "Second roads," she murmured. "Maybe they meet." He hoped so. He wanted a place where a man could set his hammer down and hear, for once, not the ring of iron on iron but the sound of someone else breathing in sleep, safe because you kept the fire. He banked the coals, tucked the heat for morning, and lay down with the smell of willow and smoke in his hair. On the other side of the small room, Ahioka did the same. Between them lay 3 feet of packed earth and 10,000 unspoken things. Over them, June kept its bright watch. Under them, the ground held. And in the dark space where grief and courage make their uneasy truce, the idea of home took its first, careful breath. Morning came slow over the basin, a thin silver edge rising behind the cottonwoods until it poured like milk through the leaves and turned the creek to a moving ribbon of light. Caleb Ward had already been up an hour, his shirt damp at the collar, chisel ringing against sandstone in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat he could control. 12 stones for a rough chimney, 4 flatter ones to cradle the skillet, a notch cut true so smoke would take the path he asked instead of the one it wanted. His forearms were leathered and nicked, small white crescents where metal had once bit. Sweat ran down the channel of his spine and darkened the faded blue of his shirt. When he glanced toward the lean-to, he saw Ahioka kneeling with a bundle of willow rods and yucca fiber, hands strong and quick as birds, weaving a basket with a mouth just wide enough for seed and a base tight enough to hold water when sealed with pine pitch. He watched the way her body moved, the quiet logic in her shoulders, the sure splay of her fingers, and thought again of the first time she had looked straight through him in the square and chosen to live anyway. The bruising at her temple had yellowed. The raw bands around her wrists had dulled to the angry pink that means skin has decided to keep you. A thin rope scar sat at the notch of her throat. Sometimes his gaze landed there and then fled like a guilty thing. 3 more, he said, tapping a stone with the chisel. We'll have a throat that draws. Ahyoka didn't stop weaving. Fire likes a mouth that tells it where to go, she said. Same as men. Some men don't listen. She cut him a look, dry as mesquite. Then they burn. By mid-morning the sun had turned the basin to a shallow bowl of heat. A pair of jays argued in the cottonwoods. A grasshopper made a machine sound in the grasses. They broke to drink from the creek, 2 handfuls for her, 3 for him, numbers that started, meaning things when water had to last, and shared a heel of biscuit with creosote honey she had gathered with maddening care from a hive hidden in a rock seam. Caleb said it was too risky. She said the bees knew her smell. He had wanted to argue, and instead had stood at the mouth of the seam with his hat ready, and his heartbeat counting the distance between a woman and pain she chose on purpose. Show me, she said now, nodding at the stones. So he did. How draft rises, how to slant the throat, how heat wants escape and will take the straightest way if you give it one. She crouched beside him, hair pulled back in a thick black rope, eyes narrowed against the glare, and then she lifted a stone the size of a child's skull and set it with the care of a midwife. He felt an odd pride of instruction offered and taken, of something shared that didn't bruise. When the chimney stood 4 feet high and stable enough, he was willing to trust it with his supper. She wiped her hands and looked toward the rim of the basin, where the land broke into old scars, wash cuts, tumbled rock, a ridge of lava like frozen lightning. Come, she said, I show you the place where wind rests. They climbed a narrow switch of deer trail, 37 steps to the first ledge, 16 more to the shoulder where juniper clung. Up close, the rocks looked like a story told out of order. Layers tilted and cracked, iron bleeding through like old rust beneath paint. She stopped at the lip of a shallow cave, only 10 feet deep, but high enough to stand and back enough to stay dry when rain forgot its manners. Here, she said, if men come, we hear them before they find the mouth. Men? He tried to keep his voice even, but the word had a way of drawing his shoulders tight without asking permission. She pointed to the ground, where 3 sets of hoof marks crossed and then sank into the harder face of the ridge. 2 days, she said, running a fingertip along the blunt crescent of a shoe. Maybe 3. The one with the short stride carries more weight, mule or poor horse. He squatted, squinting. He could read iron and heat, and the way a beam would twist if you asked too much of it. He could barely tell a deer from a cow on rock. You think they're looking for us? They look for someone. Her tone made the difference irrelevant. She stepped into the cave's shade and exhaled like a person who had been holding air for a long time. This place belongs to hawks and quiet. We borrow it. They sat where the stone stayed cool. Caleb turned his hat slowly in his hands until the felt found its own shape again. I keep thinking, he said after a while, how you sat in that cage like a person who'd already decided not to die for other people's convenience. She met his eyes, and he felt the weight of what he'd asked without words. Her voice came low, not soft. When I was 12, a winter wind took my grandmother in one night. She lay down by the fire, singing with her last breath, and we woke up to her hands still warm but her eyes already gone where mountains go. That is dying without permission, because the world says it is time. The other dying rope, bullet, cage, that is when men decide they want to eat your breath and call it law. She paused. I will not feed them twice. The cave held the truth like a cup holds water. Caleb swallowed and nodded. I left a line once, he said. Blue uniforms, brass enough to blind the sun, orders neat as a hymn. The order was wrong. It was as if a man looked me in the face and said, put your boot on that child and tell me what color its blood is when it cries. So I didn't. And when men left the line left them. I have been walking on that second road since. A slow acceptance warmed her expression. Second roads, she said, as if testing the fit of the words. Shima, my mother said, there are roads your feet take and roads your hands must build. Hands make the second roads. He opened his palm. Sitting there, polished by years of reaching into a pocket that should have stayed closed, lay a brass infantry button. This is the part of the first road I keep, he said. Not because I love it, because I want to remember how heavy anything small can be when it has the wrong story tied to it. She looked, considered, then reached into her skirt and drew out her singed beadwork square. The blue triangles gleamed the way water does when you don't think you'll taste it again. She set it in his palm beside the button. My mother's hands, she said. Yours and mine can carry both if we are stubborn. But not forever. One day we put one down. They walked back, as the light softened to that forgiving gold the territory sometimes grants like a favor. At the lean-to he set about making supper pinto beans he'd soaked in creek water, a slice of salt pork he counted like a coin, coffee boiled hard twice, because he never learned the way patience makes it taste better. Ahyoka cleaned sage and handed him a pinch, and he rolled it between finger and thumb until the smell rose green and clean out of the meat's tired salt. They ate on the threshold, where the little room met the bigger one the sky owned. Sometime in the first mouthful, she went very still, head tilted, body becoming all ear. He heard it then, too, the soft, wrong clink of metal on metal, the pause, the clink again far off, but the kind of sound the basin carried like gossip. Caleb set the tin plate aside and picked up his rifle. Ahyoka put a hand on his forearm and shook her head. No shooting, she said. Not yet. They banked the fire with damp sand until it barely breathed. In the dimness, the world's edges drew near. He counted to 60 once, twice, a third time. The sound faded, then returned from a different quarter. They waited until shadows lengthened, and the basin took its colors back from the heat. Eventually, 3 riders ghosted along the far ridge, silhouettes cut from a single piece of dusk. One had a hat brim curled high like a gambler. One slouched. The third led a mule rattling something that sounded like pots. They didn't look down, or if they did, they didn't see. Bounty hunters, Caleb breathed, mouth close to her ear before he realized the intimacy of the distance and drew back an inch. Maybe, she said, maybe men who love the way night tastes and hate the way work does. Len. He let the air go out of his lungs a little at a time until the riders slid away like trouble you owe and promised to pay on Sunday. The quiet that followed felt sharp-edged. Even the creek seemed to think before it spoke. When night finally took the basin, sleep came to Caleb in fits, like a shy animal that feeds and jumps at its own shadow. He woke to a sound he knew too well to mistake, a gasp with a broken edge in it, the kind a body makes when the mind is drowning in a memory it cannot save. He rolled to his side and saw Ahyoka sitting upright, eyes wide and not seeing him, both hands at her throat where an old rope had taught a lesson nobody deserved. He spoke her name once, twice, not touching, because touching a drowning person makes them fight the hand trying to lift them. On the third time, her gaze found him like a person who has walked a long way in the wrong direction and finally sees smoke from a home fire. Here, he said, palms up, empty. Here. Her breath slowed by inches. After a while she nodded as if to a drum only she could hear and lay back. But the sleep that took her then was the shallow kind, skittish, ready to run at a footstep's whisper. He didn't pick his own rest back up for a long time. When he did, he dreamed of a tree heavy with the wrong fruit, shackles instead of apples, stones instead of leaves. In the morning, he woke with iron on his tongue and the taste of resolve. Today, he said, when the coffee had scoured him clean, we make this place harder to find. We cut brush and drag it over our trail. I'll move the latrine and ditch a second fire pit a quarter-mile off, so smoke confuses anyone who doesn't know this basin like you do. And we go to that cave every time the wind tells the truth. Ahyoka studied him, then pointed to the line his jaw made when he decided a thing. You turn your fear into work, she said. Good. Fear that sits eats a man. Fear that runs eats him too. She smiled, small and fierce. Then we walk. They worked until the sun stood at 2 hands and then 3. He cut willow and ash. She showed him how to twist yucca fiber into cordage that didn't give up when pulled. He set 4 stakes and crossed them with 2 saplings to start a proper roof. She braided a sling to carry stones from the creek, 12 trips, 15, 20 until the chimney rose shoulder high and looked like it might be persuaded to act respectable. When his left wrist started to sing that old pain from an old fall, she took the chisel as if it belonged to her and set the last stones with the same calm the desert uses when it sets a thorn where you'll meet it later. In the lull that follows good work, she went to the creek and came back with her hair damp and her eyes clearer. "I tell you now," she said, and he knew from the quality of her voice that something long carried had decided to step down. He waited, still as a man can be and still be alive. "Dead Man Arroyo," she began. "When moon was a thin bowl, I walked with my cousin and her little boy. We took the road by night because day had eyes. We heard a mule first, then a laugh that had no teeth in it. 3 men, one with a scar that ate his mouth, one who spit before he spoke, like words tasted bad to him, one who said he was a friend to all tribes, and then taught us what friend meant." Her English faltered, and then steadied, the way a foot finds rock after slipping. "They wanted our beadwork, our blankets, our bodies. We gave the first 2, and tried to keep the last. My cousin cut the Scarmouth man. He shot her. The boy ran. I ran after, but rope runs faster when it is thrown by men who practice. Her hands had folded themselves into fists without her seeming to tell them to. She opened them 1 finger at a time. They took me. Not for long. The night has ears too. I broke his nose with my head. I broke his thumb with his own rope. I broke my breath into small pieces and hid them. I crawled from that camp like a lizard with a broken tail and left the rest of me there. In the morning I was the woman in the cage, and the town wanted to be the men in the night, but with better clothes." Caleb felt the low animal hum start in his chest and go nowhere useful. He set his hands palm down on the earth. "If those 3 men walk still," he said, "the world gets meaner every step they take." She looked at him a long time. "This basin is not a place for revenge," she said at last. "It is a place for breath. But if the road brings them here, I will not teach them mercy they never learned." He nodded because anything else would have been a lie, and the basin seemed to hate lies the way it hated standing water. It would drink them and leave a stink. Toward dusk, a line of clouds shouldered over the western rim and sent a handful of fat, warm drops to test the dust. Ahioka stood in the door of their lean-to and lifted her face to them, her expression parted between hunger and suspicion. Caleb leaned the last of the new stones into place and watched the sky gamble. The rain never committed, but it left the air sweeter and the scent of creosote sudden and clean, like someone had scrubbed the world. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll go up canyon. There's an old mine cut 7 miles west. If luck's with us, I can find a saw blade and nails that haven't rusted to useless. We need a proper door before July forgets to be kind." "I go with you," she said. He started to say no, reflex, habit, the 1,000 small, stupid ways a man tries to protect what he loves by making it smaller. He caught the thought mid-flight and put it down like a hot shoe. "We go," he corrected. "At first light. 2 can carry more than 1, and your eyes read land better." She nodded once. Acceptance without triumph. Then she turned, looked at the squat, stubborn shape of their shelter, the chalky new chimney cutting a square of darker sky, the creek bending to the will of stone because stone knew how to ask. "Kea," she said quietly. "Place." Caleb followed her gaze and felt the word settle under his skin like a coin you meant to spend and decided to save. Place. Not safe, not yet, but less dangerous than the road. A room you could stand in without remembering why you were hunted. A corner where 2 people could sleep without bargaining with the dark. He put another stick on the small fire and listened to it take, a soft sound like agreement. The basin breathed, the cottonwoods stitched wind to water, and the night stepped over the threshold of their making. Behind them lay a square, a rope, and a story he refused to let other people finish. Ahead lay 7 miles of canyon, a mine cut, and whatever metal and memory they could salvage. Between those 2 lay the hour at hand, a woman and a man, shoulders near, eyes on the same piece of sky, learning the weight and the lift of the second road they were building together. The sky opened like a pale lid over the ridges, and for a few tender minutes the world remembered how to be kind. Caleb counted the miles on his legs and the tightness in his left wrist. Old fall, old ghost, while Ahioka moved beside him with a hunter's economy, 3 paces ahead when the trail narrowed, shoulder to shoulder when the wind turned fickle. They had left the basin at first light, 1 canteen full, 1/2, 2 biscuits wrapped in old newsprint, and a coil of yucca cordage she had braided in the dark. He carried the rifle and a hammer. She carried a small knife, and the silence of someone who knows the land hears every careless word. By the time the sun rose, an arm's length above the mesas, the mouth of the mine showed itself, a black wound in a knuckle of red rock, timber braces gone gray and splintered, tailings spilling like a dried river. 15 steps to the adit, 3 crossbeams still sound. The wind coming from the shaft smelled of damp dust and iron older than scripture. "Stay near," Caleb said, tightening a strip of cloth over his mouth. "If I shout, you don't shout back, you run." Ahioka shook her head, the smallest movement. "We go in together, or not at all. Wind will carry a shout farther than feet." He gave the shadow a look that felt like bargaining with something that didn't bargain. "All right," he said, and they stepped into the cool. Inside, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The dark wasn't absolute shafts of light stabbed in through cracks overhead, but it was a living thing, all breath and watchfulness. Caleb's hand found the timber he needed by habit. Old pine, dry, but still straight. They scavenged by touch and test. He found 2 saw blades thick with rust and sanded one against a stone until teeth showed their old hunger. Ahioka found a keg under a sagging plank, rolled it with her foot, listened to the cluck inside. "Nails," she said, 100, maybe more. Enough to make a door tell the truth when it swings," he answered, and felt that small, stubborn hope flare. They stacked their haul, 2 blades, a sack of square nails, a length of frayed rope. He pried iron spikes from abandoned rails, 8, then 12, then 20, until sweat ran into his eyes and tasted like old blood. They were turning to go when the echo reached them, metal kissing stone, then a careless laugh that tried too hard. Not wind, not animal, men. Ahioka caught his sleeve and drew him deeper into a side drift where an ore cart sat cocked on a bent wheel. She reached above it, fingers finding a seam in the rock. A thin fall of grit answered. She pushed once, twice. A sliver of daylight opened above a vent, no wider than a man's shoulders. "If we climb, we come out on the ridge," she whispered. "Wind will carry our scent down, canyon." "Can you fit?" he whispered back. Her mouth tipped half a smile, half something like challenge. "I've fit through worse holes than men leave." The footfalls grew clearer. 3 sets at least, one dragging just a hair, mule in tow, the same rhythm they had heard at dusk the day before. Caleb nodded. "Go," he said. "I'll hand you the nails and blades." They worked fast and quiet, passing their salvage up, the scrape of iron on rock masked by the mine's old bones groaning in the heat. Caleb lifted last arms, straining, shoulder burning, until Ahioka caught his forearms and pulled with a strength that surprised him every time he met it. They belly crawled along the crack like lizards, came out into the glare on a shelf dotted with prickly pear, and lay still as stones while voices drifted up from the adit below. Spread out. A man barked. "If the wild woman's got herself a pet, he'll think to come to iron." Another voice, higher, nasal, eager to please. "Saw their smoke yesterday across the basin. Thin fire. Clever. Clever gets tired," said the first. "Tired gets dead." A third voice laughed, and the sound had a scar in it. "She ain't clever. She's mean. I still owe her for my thumb." Ahioka's hand tightened on the rock. Caleb felt, rather than saw, the small tremor run through her. Scarmouth, the rope thrower whose thumb she'd broken. He pictured the rope cutting that old mark at her throat, felt the heat rise in him like a forge gone dangerous. "Careful," she breathed. "Heat is loud." He forced air out slow. "We can't outrun 3 on horses." "Then we don't run," she said. "We make the ground walk for us." They slid along the shelf to a break in the ridge where a wash cut steeply down. Below, the mine's tailings made a pale chute, Above, the rock fractured into shelves and loose shale. Ahyoka scanned, measured with her palm, then with her hand flared flat like a hawk's wing. "There," she said, pointing to a ledge held by one stubborn pillar of sandstone, thinner than a man's chest. "If it falls, the wash will choke. Dust will blind. They will think the mountain hates them. You sure it won't hate us first?" "We move like water," she said, "not like rock." They stowed the nails and blades behind a juniper and went to work with what the ridge gave. Caleb wedged the pick into a fracture and leaned. The rock talked back in little pings, then a crack. Ahyoka set a pry they'd made from a rail spike, bearing with her legs, not her arms. On the third heave the pillar at go with a sound like ribs breaking. The shelf leapt, slumped, and slid, carrying brush, stones, and a cough of powdered earth that rose in a red breath. The wash below filled, then spilled. Dust billowed back through the adit like old hate released. Men shouted curses, then orders. "Back! Back out!" Hooves scrambled. The mule brayed panic. Ahyoka grabbed Caleb's wrist. Now, they ran along the ridge's spine, not in panic, but in that lean, measured way that says a body has made a contract with distance. At a bend they flattened against the rock as the three riders burst from the mine mouth coughing and gray-faced, eyes running. Up close, Caleb marked them the way a man marks a blueprint. Scar mouth on the sorrel, a strip of leather binding his right hand where the thumb sat crooked, the sloucher with a bandana, a third with a gambler's hat, and a rifle too clean for a workman. Scarmouth wheeled, searching the heights, and that broken smile split his face. "There," he barked, pointing. "Above, that's her. That." He spurred, the others followed, and for a handful of seconds it was all noise, hooves, rocks, the rattle of the mule's harness, the ping of a dislodged stone bouncing end over end into the wash. Caleb slid from cover, planted the rifle across a knee of rock, and sighted not at a heart but at a hat. He fired once. The gambler's hat jumped, spun, and sailed, and the man tumbled off the far side of his horse, cursing more from surprise than pain. "Next shot takes a shoulder," Caleb shouted. "Third takes a knee. Go home." Scarmouth laughed. "How about we take you, blacksmith? Sheriff in Fallow Ridge pays a bounty for fools and savages in equal coin." "Sheriff Bradley pays for quiet," said a new voice, flat and cold as creek water in winter. Caleb's head jerked toward the switchback and the man who had materialized there. Marcus Garrett, dust to his knees, eyes bright with a grief that had aged a month in a week. He stood 2 ledges down, revolver holstered, hands empty, as if he had come to argue with ghosts, and found instead what he wanted. "Marcus," Scarmouth said, surprise twitching his mouth. "Didn't figure you for a ridge goat." "Figured enough to follow your mess," Garrett answered. He didn't look at Caleb. He looked at Ahyoka, and his jaw worked as if he were chewing the hard rind of something he'd said too long. "You killed my brother?" Ahyoka didn't blink. "He came to our camp with a gun," she said. "He was drunk. He pointed at a 4-year-old boy and called him thief. He fired into the ground at the child's feet to make him jump and laugh. The child did not laugh. My cousin cut his shoulder. He raised his gun. I raised my hands. He slipped. He hit his head on a stone and slept without waking." Garrett's face changed in small, ugly ways, and then settled. "Tom always was a damned fool with liquor," he said, and the break in his voice was not from dust. "Always needed the world to be the reason for his temper." He turned to Scarmouth. "You didn't say that part." Scarmouth spat dust. "Because it ain't true, she's lying. They're all liars." He lifted his bound hand and wagged it. "She did this. Rope like a snake, thumb like a twig. She's mean." "Mean," Ahyoka repeated, tasting the word and discarding it. "I learned it from men who taught it with their boots." Caleb kept the rifle steady, breath measured to a long count. "Marcus," he said, risking the man's given name because titles often made men harder. "You want justice. So do I. Let the judge weigh it. But if you hire wolves to hunt your grief, don't expect them to bring home saints." "Lem." As if to prove the point, the third man, the sloucher with the bandana, eased his rifle up, eyes slitted, all the talk of parley a nuisance to his trigger finger. Ahyoka saw before Caleb did. Her hand flashed, the yucca cordage she'd braided in the night uncoiling with a whisper. She threw low, not for neck but for wrists, and the loop bit true. She yanked. The rifle's barrel swung, discharging into empty sky. The report cracked off the ridge and rolled away like thunder, looking for a mountain to argue with. Scarmouth yanked his horse hard, cursed, and went for his own gun. Caleb fired again, shoulder, as promised, and the man lurched backward, surprised into a howl, his pistol skittering down the slope in a clatter of angry metal. The gambler reached for his fallen hat, thought better, and put both palms in the air. "I was just hired to ride," he said, voice trembling into honesty. Everything stilled then, the kind of still that is loud with choices. Wind pressed their clothes. A vulture drew one lazy figure 8 above, as if the sky had an opinion but wouldn't share it yet. Garrett turned slowly, taking in the bandana man tangled in yucca, Scarmouth swearing through blood, the gambler trembling, Caleb with the rifle easy in his hands, Ahioka standing with a rope that could have been mercy or not. He rubbed his jaw, looked at the mine, at the fresh slide, at the ridge that had chosen its side for now. "My brother went up there looking for someone to blame for his losses," he said at last, voice scuffed raw. "Cattle gone missing, a banknote coming due. He heard stories about a wild woman, about a camp with silver stashed. He was always a crow for shiny things." He lifted his eyes to Ahioka. "I can't bury him with a better truth than he earned, but I can stop adding wrong to wrong." "Late?" He faced Scarmouth. "You and your boys get off this ridge. You come sniffing around their basin again, I put your name in the judge's ear, and then in the dirt." Scarmouth snarled. "You ain't sheriff, Marcus." "No," Garrett said, and his hand rested on his revolver like a man greeting an old friend he'd rather not see. "I'm a man who loved Tom and knows what love looks like when it's done wrong. I'm done doing it wrong." The gambler nodded so fast his hat nearly fell again. "Yes, sir." He slid from his horse, helped the bandana man untangle, and got them both turned. Scarmouth stayed a beat too long, hate bright in his eyes, then spat once more and heeled his sorrel downslope, shoulder bleeding in a line that would scar honest. Garrett waited until they were small on the trail. Then he looked up. "I don't know your name," he said to Caleb. "Caleb Ward." "Ward," he repeated. He glanced at Ahioka. "And yours?" "Ahioka. Lay." He tested the syllables as if making room for them in his mouth. "Ahioka. I won't pretend I forgive what I believed. Not in a day. But I will keep my men from making a worse thing out of what already island." He blew out a breath, scrubbed a hand across his face, and managed something like a rueful smile. "If you make a door that doesn't squeal, bring one to Cedar Falls. Mrs. Henderson hates hers something fierce." Caleb blinked, then nodded once. "We will." "That." Garrett tipped his hat and picked his way down the switchback, not looking back. Silence returned, but it was a different silence, less like the pause before a shot, and more like the breath two people take after they realize they have not died. Caleb sank onto a rock, felt his hands tremble now that they were allowed. Ahioka coiled the rope again, precise as a prayer, then sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You aimed at a hat," she said. "And a shoulder," he said. "I keep the third shot for knees I can't talk sense to." Her mouth tipped. "You are careful with your killing." "I'm careful with my living," he said, and the answer surprised him with its own truth. They retrieved the nails and the saw blades, the pick, the sack of spikes. On the ridge, the wind shifted, bringing the faint, sweet scent of rain maybe an hour away, maybe not at all. They started back, burdened but lighter, the way people feel when a story stops biting and starts listening. Near the basin, the cottonwoods stood like watchmen with kindness, leaves chattering about nothing and everything. They reached their lean-to as the first fat drops found dust and made it sing. Caleb set the nails down on the table he'd built from a split pine and a prayer. Ahioka hung the coil of rope on a peg as if it were any other tool, neither devil nor blessing, only what a hand makes of it. When the rain became rain for real, they stood in the doorway under their half-roof and watched the world turn softer by degrees. In the hiss of water on sand and the low drum on stone, in the smell of creosote giving up its secret, There was a tenderness that made both of them feel suddenly, dangerously human. Ahioka spoke first. "You did not have to speak to Garrett." "I did," he said. "Second roads don't build themselves. Lun." She slid her singed beadwork square from her skirt and laid it on the sill where the light could love it. He took the brass button from his pocket and set it beside her square, two small heavies that had dragged 4 lives through dust, and together they watched the rain wash the ridge clean. "Tomorrow," he said, "a door that tells the truth." "Tomorrow," she echoed, then leaned her shoulder into his, letting the contact last past caution. Outside, the basin drank. Inside, the chimney drew true for the first time, the smoke rising where it should. And for the length of a summer rain, 20 minutes, maybe 25, their rough-boned shelter felt like a promise kept. By 7 in the morning, the street was already a brass plate, horses blowing salt breath while men lifted their hats with 2 fingers and kept moving. Caleb Ward came in slow with the mule, and a door lashed to the travois, a full plank of ponderosa, with a tongue and groove fit and hinges he'd hammered from a saw blade, salvaged out at Old Silver Cut. Ahioka walked beside him, one hand to the lead rope, one to her braid to keep the wind from writing knots in it. The door looked simple from a distance. Up close, you could see the care. Beveled edge to shed rain, cross brace, set on a true diagonal, iron strap hinges oiled so clean, the pin would whisper instead of complain. Mrs. Henderson met them on the boardwalk, cheeks pink with the heat and the long quarrel she'd been carrying with her own back room. "If this one squeals," she declared, "I'll set fire to the whole place and take up sleeping in the alley." Caleb smiled. "Then let's not make you an arsonist." "No." They shouldered the old door 3 men, and a curse set it aside, and hung the new. He tapped the hinge pins with 2 careful strokes, checked the swing, and stepped back. Ahioka lifted her chin as if listening for a bird. Caleb pushed. The door went open like a good breath and came back home without a sound. A murmur went down the boardwalk as clear as a creek. "There it is. That's the way. Listen to that." A child clapped. Someone whistled. Mrs. Henderson put both hands to her hips and laughed like a woman who'd been given back 5 minutes of rest every day for the rest of her life. "How much do I owe you?" $2 for the door, 50 cents for the hinges, and whatever you think a quiet life is worth," Caleb said. The joke landed easy. A half-dozen coins changed hands, and a sack of sugar found its way into their pile besides. Marcus Garrett stepped out from the barber with his jaw clean-shaven, and his grief worn where a man wears it when he's decided to keep breathing anyway behind the eyes, along the corners of the mouth. He looked at the door, then at the 2 who'd brought it, then at the town that had come out to watch. "That's good work," he said. "Better than Tom ever put his name to." He lifted his hat to Ahioka. "Ma'am." The word came rough and honest. It was an apology without a speech and a truce without a handshake. She met it with the smallest nod that meant, "I heard you. I'll keep the ground level." By 10, the heat began to taste like brass and old coffee. 2 riders clattered in from the north with their hats in their hands, talking at a pace that made the air jump. "Flash," one said. "Arroyo south of the cotton patch. Brewster's boy is out there with a wagon like a raft." Henderson cursed and went for a coil of rope. People moved like a single body, split into many legs. Caleb felt the old hand of purpose take his shoulder. "We've got rope," he said, already untying the yucca cordage Ahioka had braided by moonlight. She was beside him. "And a door," she added. They reached the arroyo 2 minutes ahead of the wall of muddy water. It came around the bend, with a sound like a crowd shouting in a language no one wanted to learn. In the middle of the channel, a light wagon sat canted on a spit of sand, wheels screaming. A boy of maybe 12, frozen on the seat, with both fists in the reins. "Drop it," Caleb barked. "Let him ride it out." The boy's eyes jumped to Caleb's face, found something he could believe, and let go. The mule lunged, the wagon slewed, and the left wheel climbed the far bank, then slid, then stopped halfway between luck and gravity. Caleb looked at the door on the travois, looked at the water, and didn't think again. "Bridge," he said. He and Marcus lifted the plank between them, and with 2 heaves and a grunt, shoved it out over the cut like a tongue. "Hold, you stubborn, beautiful thing," Caleb told the timber, as if talking to a horse. Ahioka looped the yucca rope around a cottonwood, took a turn around her own waist, and crawled onto the door. She curved her body low, belly sliding on the varnished wood, and reached the boy. "Hands," she said. He gave them, knuckles white and shaking. She tied him off with 2 smart hitches and looked up. "Now," she said. They hauled. The door flexed and held. The boy came over the lip of the arroyo, like an idea you didn't dare believe until it stood in front of you. He fell into his father's arms. The crowd exhaled a single long sound that pulled the sting out of the air. "Good rope," Marcus said, panting. Ahioka cinched the coil with a neat tail and passed it to him. "Second roads," she said. He nodded as if the words fit his mouth better than he'd expected. By noon, Cedar Falls went back to buying and selling and telling the day to behave. But something had shifted. Strangers became names. A woman labeled Wild became the person who'd crawled the length of a door to pull a kid out of a bad idea Water had about who belonged to whom. Henderson sent them away with flour and coffee and a jar of peaches she swore she'd been hoarding since spring. Garrett tipped his hat again and said, "If you bring a bell to hang, we'll find a place to put it." Someone at the saloon said the kind of line men use when they want a story to braid the night around. "Now that's the stuff Wild West love is made of." Another man added, half awed, half grinning, "That's one for the cowboy love stories, sure enough." The words were rough and sweet, a little ridiculous, and a little true. The way town talk bends toward legend as soon as it knows the ending is good. They headed home in the long light, dust lifting behind the mule like smoke from a well-kept fire. At mile 4, the heat softened. At mile 6, a breeze came down from the igneous spine to the west, carrying pine and the clean after-smell of the arroyo's tantrum. By the time they reached the basin at 6 o'clock, shadows were standing tall in the cottonwoods, and the creek was low again, pretending it had never tried to climb its own banks. Caleb hung the new latch on their half-door iron hook, hardwood catch, and made a show of testing it, as if they had an audience besides the swallows gossiping under the eaves. "Truth-telling door," he said, easing it shut. It whispered yes and met the jamb square. Ahioka smiled with her mouth and her eyes both. "Now the wind knocks," she said, "and we decide." They put the peaches on the shelf he'd built. He banked the coals. She unbound her hair and combed dust from the ends with a bone pick, patient as rain. When they had done their quiet chores, his hands in tools, hers in food, both in the work of leaving no edge sharp where a tired body might meet it, Caleb went to the small forge he'd made from an old stove lid and a bed of coals fed by a goatskin bellows. He'd been keeping something beneath a scrap of sacking like a man keeps a fragile hope from drafts. Now he pulled it free. "Say when," he said. She tilted her head. "When? What?" "When I ask a second time and mean the first choice more than the first necessity." He set the piece in the coals. It was a band he'd twisted out of 3 metals, iron for strength and the honest stain it leaves on skin, silver for the way it catches light like water in motion, and copper for the warmth that lives even when the fire's gone to sleep. He brought it to Orange, hammered it down to round true, filed the seam until there wasn't one, and quenched it with a hiss that sounded like a secret being told the right person. Ahioka watched without fidgeting. A woman whose life has been argued by other people learns to let silence do the asking. When he set the ring on the table, glinting like a coin thrown into dawn, he reached into his pocket with his other hand and brought out the brass button. He laid it beside her singed beadwork square on the sill where afternoon gather light pooled. "I was a man someone else's law could turn into a tool," he said. "You were a woman men tried to turn into a lesson. We refused them, and they called us names loud enough to make the wind remember. I don't need the wind's memory. I need yours. Ahioka, will you take me a second time? Not because there was a cage, but because there is a door, and it tells the truth when it closes." She didn't reach for the ring. She stepped closer and put 2 fingers to the place at his throat, where the pulse runs like a creek you trust. "You kept me alive in front of men who wanted a rope to write my story," she said. "You learned my roads without stealing them. You listen when I say fear is loud, and you answer. Then let us give it work." She touched the ring at last, the way you touch a living thing. "Yes." He slid the band onto her finger. It sat like it had been waiting for that exact piece of ham. She pulled a leather thong from the inside of her skirt, the beadwork her mother had made, the square that had traveled, scorched, but whole, and knotted it around his wrist with the same careful strength she put into tying a lifeline around a boy on a flood. "We choose," she said, and the words put their own roof over the moment. They ate peaches right from the jar with spoons, laughing when the juice ran down their wrists. The sky went that deep copper that makes a person try to remember every good thing they ever did. The first star came on, then 3, then 7. The breeze brought coyotes from the far ridge. Their voices not lonely so much as honest. "This is where we are. This is what we want. This is how the night holds us." Caleb took the brass button, weighed it, and then set it in the chimney stone while the mortar still remembered how to take a shape. "I'll keep the story," he said, "but not in my pocket. This." Ahyoka tucked her mother's square into a little niche he'd carved in the doorframe, high but not hidden. "So it sees us leave and come home," she said. "So it hears us sing bad and laugh anyway." He grinned. "Spirits listen closer when we sing bad." "They laugh," she agreed. "Good. Let them laugh." 2 days later they went back to town with a second door and a stack of hinges and a small bell Caleb had hammered into Grace from an old plowshare. Henderson hung the bell over her shop and rang it twice for luck. Garrett came from across the street and listened like a man who needed the sound to stitch up some rip inside him. "We'll put one of these on the church when the roof stops leaking," he said. "You'll ring it, Ahyoka. The town will know the hour because your hands say so." Or, at the saloon, a fellow with a fiddle tucked under his beard started up a tune, and a girl with a red ribbon in her hair grabbed Ahyoka's hands before anyone could ask permission. "Dance," the girl insisted. "Dance like we didn't almost drown on Tuesday." Ahyoka let herself be pulled for one turn, then 2, moving with that grounded grace that is half earth, half sky. Caleb leaned against the post and watched the world make room. Men who had flinched at her shadow now flinched because she smiled at them by accident, and their chests did a queer thing. Women who had narrowed their eyes now widened them, the way people do when a map finally matches the ground. Someone at the back table said it again, that phrase the territory uses when it's trying to say something real and can't without dressing it in a story. Add this to the Wild West love stories, boys, the kind that's got dust in its teeth and soft hands anyway. The room chuckled and nodded, and if the words were big, they were big in the direction of blessing. Even legends earn their supper. They went home at twilight. The mule trudged like a philosopher who keeps his conclusions to himself. 8 miles, 2 creek crossings, 1 hawk hanging over the far ridge like a coin someone forgot to spend. When they reached their truth-telling door, the basin opened its evening the way a host opens both arms. He lit the lamp. She set the coffee to boil. And in the middle of ordinary work, a quiet came down that felt like a hand on the back of the heart, steadying it. "Tomorrow," he said, because tomorrow had become their kindest spell, "I'll plane the sill so winter doesn't get bold." "Tomorrow," she said, and leaned her shoulder into his so the word had more than one pillar to stand on. Outside, crickets stitched the dark together. Inside, the chimney drew sweet and straight. 2 small tokens, metal and thread, watched from their places. The ring shone in lamplight the color of honey. And if, down in Cedar Falls, some storyteller put their names into cowboy love stories, or tucked them between the pages of Wild West Love and other Wild West love stories, whispered across tables, sticky with whiskey, it didn't matter. The only audience they needed was the cottonwoods and the creek and the door that knew how to say yes when it closed. In the night, she woke once with the old rope at her throat and found only his hand, warm and open, where the fear wanted to be. In the morning, he woke with the taste of iron gone and only coffee on his tongue. They stepped out to count the sky's coins, to measure the day like honest tradesmen, and to spend their breath where it belonged, on work, on laughter, on the second road that had become simply the road home. 窗体顶端